You know, in all honesty, though, this feels a little bit to me like my last job at CNN. I have two guests in two different parts of the globe. We're going to bring them together. Maria and I were just speaking on TV together a few weeks ago, but we have some updates on her case since then. So we're going to basically connect folks from around the world for this session. The beauty of this versus my last job is that we can go for more than 5 minutes. Oftentimes, the conversation just gets good when you start to wrap it on TV. So we're going to avoid that problem today. And Maria, you know what I'm talking about. You're a former CNNer as well. So Maria, I think whenever you and I speak, I always want to start with you on the latest on your legal battle. It feels like every week or every month I read something new about the government's pursuit of you and Rappler. So can you give us an update on where things stand?
So since the last time we spoke, I think I have a little bit of good news. I've been allowed to travel. So it looks like my right to travel hasn't been hindered. So yay, good news. But the flip side is, any day, technically, Rappler could get shut down. But we're also still growing, right? And then also, I've had to appeal the decision from the Court of Appeals on cyber libel. So essentially, on July 7th, the Court of Appeals turned down our appeal for reconsideration of the decision of the regional court on cyber libel. So, and here's the hard part of that. It actually added to the sentence. So not only did they say, we're right, you not only even though you didn't write, edit, or supervise that piece, and the law didn't really exist before you published, you're still going to go to jail for 6 years, and we're going to add another 8 months to it. So that was kind of where that is. It's now we filed the motion for reconsideration. The only next step after that is the Supreme Court. So we're gearing up. I guess I'm optimistic. I'm always optimistic with the two of you guys. So yay.
And with the new administration, does that make any meaningful change for you, or do we not know yet?
We don't know. TBD. I think that was what I said the last time. And, there's plausible deniability. The last changes, the forward movement of the court cases happened at the tail end of the Duterte administration. It could be a gift to the Marcos administration, or it could be, just a way to punch at the end. And then let's see what the Marcos administration does. We're doing our jobs. This month is History Month for Rappler because this is, Marcos, the father of our president now, his birthday. It's also declaration of martial law. 50th. It's a very, very strange time for the Philippines. And we continue doing our jobs. So fingers crossed.
Well, I know from interviewing you at 11 a.m. Eastern in New York before that you're staying up late for us. It's going to be basically midnight for you. So let me ask you and then go to Richard on the topic of our session today, holding the line for journalism. There's a great through line here from Dean and Julia's conversations earlier to you. You've made the phrase hold the line an international symbol. So for you and then for Richard, what does hold the line mean for you, Maria?
Yeah, for me, it's very simple. There are certain rights guaranteed by the Constitution of the Philippines, which is roughly patterned after the United States. We have a Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of the press. All of these things are part of our Constitution. And that's the line I stand on as a journalist. I am not pro anyone or anti anyone. I'm not anti Duterte, nor am I anti Marcos. I do my job. And in doing that, I exercise my rights. I think the government tried to push me off that line when they first arrested me in 2019. That was when I received 10 arrest warrants in less than 2 years during that time period. We continue doing our jobs. Hold the line, right? We're not for or against you. We are doing our jobs. Journalism is not a crime.
Richard, what does it mean to you, hold the line for journalism?
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm disappointed that I wasn't there in New York to join all of you. I so much appreciate and value the work that you do. It inspires me. Not just Maria. Maria has inspired me for a long time, but everyone in the room there who is doing this extraordinary work is very much influences what I try to do. I think the question of holding the line is a very, very challenging one today, and it cuts across so many things. As we pointed out, I mean, we have, unfortunately, an increasing trend towards authoritarian governments or near authoritarian governments who seek to control the media. But it even goes beyond that. I think it's quite unfortunate today, the amount of, I think, short-sighted thinking in the policy arena that seeks either to better enable those who have particular political influence or embedded players versus efforts to try to really stimulate a new generation of journalistic voices and journalistic thinking. But I think it also goes beyond that. I was with the prior panel was quite interesting. I think the notion of improving the understanding of our societies, of the value of journalism in the first place, is extraordinarily important. And is something among many questions that I think everyone in this room should be concerned about and focused on. How do we make sure that our societies understand the role of journalism in those societies, and that we are doing the jobs necessary to earn their trust and support and belief in the work that we do?
But aren't we losing on that, Richard?
I think we are losing on that. I mean, if you look at trend data, if you look simply at the question of, let's look at the second part, and I'll get back to the first part. If you look at trend data in terms of the regard for the press, right, it's been going down for decades. It didn't start with the internet, but certainly the internet propelled it even further. I think that's a massively important question. I look at the number of people who simply don't care about the news or will refuse to consume the news because it upsets them, it disturbs them. They don't believe what they hear, whether it's from the legitimate press or not. When I look at the regulatory sphere, yeah, I see deep concerns there. All of us are concerned about misinformation and disinformation. As someone noted earlier, that comes from many sources. It's not just dark states, it's not just social media. It comes from the media itself, comes from politicians itself. So when I see, for instance, approaches to legislation dealing with online harms, that's a very tricky question, right? We're not talking about illegal speech, we're talking about awful but lawful speech, which is so incredibly hard to define. And so how do we make sure in approaching public policy that we don't create the tools that subsequent leaders who may not be properly motivated in terms of the objective of those efforts use them against journalists themselves? Maria knows that extraordinarily and powerfully well from her experiences in the Philippines.
Maria? Well, let me ask you a question, Maria. Let me ask you this. What does Richard get wrong about this? Or what does Google get wrong about this? Let's make it spicy.
So Brian, thanks. But, I was also listening to the tail end of the panel, and I will actually Siddharth is no longer on the stage, but, I don't think the problem of distrust is something necessarily that journalists can do anything about. I think our distribution system that is now been really now under the control of technology companies has pushed a race to the bottom. Look, let me not get this wrong. Before that, television, we were already in a race to the bottom, but we all shared the same reality, i.e. when we worked for television, you could see the same screen. Now, those screens are splintered into billions of different realities. Each one of those users told that they could determine their own, but the reality is you can't determine your own reality. There is a public sphere, there is a set of facts. Those facts are not debatable. You can debate exactly positions or what to do next, but you can't debate that there are three of us having a conversation here in front of a room full of people and people online, right? That's a fact. So let's not debate that. What's happened globally is that journalists, and Siddharth said this, he said, well, it's been around for a long time. Here's the big difference. Yes, governments have lied, people have lied, but they have never been able to lie so exponentially and in such a targeted manner that they can change what you think, that they can actually turn the platform that delivers the news to you, social media, into a behavior modification system. And that is what we've seen. We've seen advertising and marketing tactics turned into a weapon by geopolitical power. And there's no defense for journalists under attack in that scenario. So I would posit that the time when we lost control is when news organizations lost their distribution power to tech, and we still maintain control of content. We look at every solution to the problems we have today as a content problem. It isn't.
Richard?
Well, certainly I'm not going to attempt to defend all of tech, nor for that matter, all of journalism. I can only speak to our efforts, and specifically to our efforts in areas like Google search. I think the one thing we know is, yes, technology has enabled free expression beyond what we've ever seen in the history of civilization, good, bad, and indifferent. Right? And yes, it is the responsibility of platforms like ours to be sure that we, on the one hand, are not getting in the way of free expression, are allowing people to find information about the subjects they're looking for and voices that they're interested in, at the same time that we're not amplifying in any inappropriate way voices that are spewing misinformation and disinformation without question, without question. But I feel when we look at these challenges, I've never felt that in our own self-interest, and I speak here as someone who's been involved in journalism for 50 years, that we cannot look to others to solve our problems. And so when I raise questions about the need for journalists and the journalism community to look at these questions, it's in our own self-interest and importance to do so. Right? When I look at the journalism sphere, one thing I look at, the news sphere in general, is like we have an extraordinary amount of opinion. Right? You know this very well, Brian, from your work at CNN, right? How helpful is it for us to have ongoing confrontational chat shows with one spinmeister competing with another spinmeister? What do you think that does to the perceptions of our audiences in terms of where they can find the rightful, trustful information that they should have as the informed citizens they need to be? So it's much more complex. I wish one could snap our fingers and say, oh, tech can solve it, or snap our fingers and say public policy can solve it. But that would be very, very dangerous on our part to assume such things. All of these things need to look at and looked at very closely.
Maria, I think there's probably a common agreement among all of us here that we do have to solve our own problems, at least to some degree, right? All be a part of the solutions.
Yes, I agree that journalists really do need to look like, well, one of the things that journalists can do right off the top is understand tech, do more tech, right? We tend again to look at, because we're journalists, we look at everything as if it's a content solution. And in some ways, Richard, you also did that, right? You look at the content, opinion versus analysis, right? What a thin line between that. But the reality is that the incentive structure of the platforms that deliver that content, whether it's opinion or a factual analysis, actually spreads the opinion that is more incendiary faster and further than the factual kind of shoe leather reporting that we used to do. Journalists today, in the old sense of, the 5 Ws, I don't think people stick to that anymore. We add it as context, but if you use that on social media, which is where, in the Philippines, 6 years in a row, Filipinos spent the most time online and on social media globally, right? If I were to do that and not capture this young demographic audience, it would never get distribution. And so that's where, the quality of the journalism is also determined by the algorithms of distribution of the technology platforms. I would say they have an inordinate amount of power, not just to degrade journalism, but to also be able to set the stage for autocracies, digital autocracies, to set the stage for Russia versus Ukraine, for the Philippines versus, and you know me, Richard and I have talked about this a long time, but let me find a common ground with Richard, right? I do agree that this is a time when laws need to be put in place, because you're not going to ask the platforms to find their own solutions. They don't have a set of standards and ethics that journalists had. Like, we were struggling with that. Even as journalists, we had, the business, the editorial part managed by an editorial manager, and then you have the business part, right? And they clash. There's a check and balance there. But most famously, of course, this has been written about numerous times, Meta, Facebook, now Meta, both of those fall under the same person. And so the conflict of interest isn't there. So the question there is, what kinds of policies? How do we protect the manipulation of our minds from this insidious technology that is bringing us content at an accelerated, the Russian saying, the fire hose of falsehoods, or maybe that was one of the think tanks that said this, but that is what's coming at us. It's coming at us this way. Our rational mind can't deal with it. So our thinking fast mind, our emotions, our Paleolithic emotions are the ones that are making us make choices in the world. And that goes down to elections, to whom we vote for.
Well, to both of you, Richard first, what policies, what laws, what specifics should be in place?
So, first of all, I don't want anyone to come to the conclusion that somehow Maria and I are always at odds, because we're not.
Oh, I know.
We're in agreement 95% of the time. It gets off into the detail of how you address these things, because this is an area of extraordinary nuance, right? So I just want to be very clear on that. For instance, we use the term platforms. I despise the term platforms. It's a generic term that is not generic. So we need to be specific, frankly, very specific about the services and products and approaches that are providing particular challenges. Yes, there is that core point that we've known in the history of media that unfortunately, seemingly confrontation and disaster and ugliness is more appealing than not. You know this in the world of television. I came out of the world of television. It bleeds, it leads, right? That's unfortunate. Same as I said earlier about, confrontation chat shows on cable news networks. It's because it's confrontational that it's seen to be appealing to our audiences, whether it's useful and valuable to our audiences at all as well. So these are very challenging areas. I think there's a lot that can be done. I do think that we need to figure out in the world of public policy, how do we stimulate new voices, right? How do we drive innovation in the space? I think we have both a need and an opportunity to seriously rethink journalism. I don't look at the prior era and say, oh, everything was great and superb, quality journalism all over the place. Yes, there was some of it. But we have an opportunity. I've always felt we've had a great opportunity in the digital space to really rethink, not only bring in more diverse voices, but bring in voices who can really begin to approach the problem in different ways. I'm a big fan of those who are approaching it with constructive journalism, for instance, to my earlier point. How do we get to the larger dimensions of our society who can begin to see the value in journalism in improving their lives?
I was
right.
thinking,
That's an extraordinarily important and valuable thing for us to approach.
One of the questions you raised in a recent talk was how can we reach those who don't care or have lost interest in journalism? I always find that to be so interesting, Richard. There are lots of news brands that appeal to news junkies. There are far fewer that might appeal to the people you're describing.
That's right, and it's unfortunate. And instead, obviously, it's replaced often by media that simply, entertains and distracts. I go back to a book that some of you know back from the 80s called Amusing Ourselves to Death. I feel that often is what's happening in our media space today. All right, we can drift to the TikToks of the world and so on and so forth. I don't want to point solely at TikTok. It's far beyond that. But how do we find ways? That in itself is an area of interest, right? Here's an interesting thing, is our societies guide themselves by forms of media that people can easily absorb, that's convenient to absorb, right? Now that's obviously a particular challenge in the world of journalism where things cannot get reduced to a meme. So how do we address that? How do we find ways to both address new audiences and new forms of media to be effective in providing thoughtful, substantial journalism?
Maria, is Richard letting Google off the hook?
I think Richard is letting most tech off the hook. And, I'll say this. Last week, Dimitri and I, in the Nobel Peace Center, launched a 10-point action plan that called for an end to the surveillance, for profit, or what Shoshana Zuboff called surveillance capitalism, yet this business model that drives most of the technology companies. And this business model, what we have done in the public sphere as journalists, we fall right into this. We write for a long time. Brian, we wrote about how fantastic the tech is. I love it. I love the tech, right? So yes, I was, my gosh, the truest of true believers in social media, until the greed of these companies got to the point that they had manipulated us and they degraded the public sphere. And this is where surveillance capitalism comes in. And all the social media platforms use this. It is insidious manipulation. It is also, think about it like this, right? For everything that you write on social media, machine learning comes in and creates a model of you that knows you better than you know yourself. When you say model, that feels like, oh yeah, it's just a model. Because the company then says it owns that model. Change the word model to clone, right? So imagine if our private thoughts, our emotions are cloned. And then a company that clones us says, that's mine. And all of that is pushed up by AI. This is the database. This now is the mother load of data that is used to micro-target advertising. So this is something that news organizations haven't done because we don't have that data. And frankly, the question, what we did in that 10-point action plan is we called on democratic governments around the world to protect us from this. Because when you're talking about changing this, we must reimagine the world today, not just with what journalists can do better, but we must reimagine a democratic vision for the 21st century of the internet. The driving force of the internet are these private companies. And in many ways, democratic governments have gone hands off, with the United States being among the first, and that must change. So we say, surveillance for profit, that shouldn't be happening. And then we came out with other things. Of course, journalism is an antidote. But right now, as the person who is being attacked by information operations, Facebook took down information operations from China that was attacking me in September 2020. Who am I? I'm only one journalist. Why am I the target of information operations? Why should governments be allowed to get away with impunity? I'm not saying China, but this is what is happening. And I think I go down to one last thought, which is that impunity online, it doesn't stay online. Impunity online leads to impunity offline. And this is part of the reason we're seeing a kind of death by 1,000 cuts of our democracies, because rule of law anchors us. And that rule of law has allowed incredible impunity. Russia, it's already been proven in the 2016 elections that information warfare was waged against citizens. Information warfare was waged in Crimea, in Ukraine. We know this. In Myanmar, both Facebook and the UN sent fact-finding teams to Myanmar. They both came out with the idea that the social media platform played a role in genocide. Why does this impunity continue? And then the last thought I would say for this is, I now compare us. If you guys have seen the Great Migration, if you've gone on an African safari, this is now the way I feel, right? Like if you've seen the wildebeests trying to cross a ravine, this took 6 hours or so to watch, but there's so many wildebeests that they're pushing the ones right up front. They get to the edge of the ravine and they push the ones up front into the ravine, right? And they keep pushing them in. The ones at the bottom are eaten by the crocodiles. And then the ones just keep dying on top of them until they can walk on top of the horses to the other side. I feel like journalists, especially in the global South, we are those wildebeests getting tossed into the ravine until legislation kicks in.
Well, they need to hold the line.
Yes. But why should we be the ones doing all the sacrificing? And why should these technology companies be printing money based on that?
Well, that 10-point plan, the 10-point plan you mentioned, it's up on Rappler.com. I do have a compliment for Google in a moment, Richard, but first, do you want to react to what Maria just said?
No, I mean, I agree with much of what Maria says. I by no means feel that tech should be let off the hook. I've been at Google a long time.
Yeah.
I don't believe in surveillance capitalism for profit or for non-profit, for that matter. Right? There are huge issues there. We need much better privacy legislation. We believe in that. You know, we're a company, at least in all my experience, has always been very careful at how it uses data, at how it applies data, at how we're extraordinarily careful to use only aggregated data, not release it to the outside world. But certainly there are tech companies out there who've done extraordinarily damaging things.
So
right?
that compliment
and they damage the ecosystem for all of us. So I don't by any means suggest anyone should be let off the hook in these regards.
Yeah. In our final 15 minutes, we'll take questions from the audience here in New York and in the chat. I was thinking, Richard, about areas that progress has been made. You know, and that this sets you up for a question about where do we still need to make more progress? Where are the areas that we're failing? But I was thinking the other day, I was at the county fair with my kids when I read a Google alert that said I'd been arrested. And it was, of course, from they call it a satire site, but it was a site full of lies and garbage. And to Google's credit, when you Google Brian Stelter arrested, you see the fact checks, you see the corrections, you see the Pentagon denying the lie. So I very much appreciated, first, that the Pentagon told the truth, and second, that Google surfaces the truth above the lie site. And so I feel like that's an example of progress, right? 6-7 years ago, when the term fake news was popularized before Donald Trump weaponized it, that problem was very real, and the lie was showing up before the truth. So I cite that as a very concrete, minor, to me amusing when I'm on the Ferris wheel with my daughter, but an example of progress we've made, right, Richard? So where are the areas that we're still failing? Where are the areas where, in order for that to work, by the way, you need fact-checking sites to exist, you need the algorithms to notice those sites and rank those sites. So it's working together between two sides of this conversation. Where are we not succeeding in that space yet? Where are we failing the audience in that regard?
Well, I think there continues to be a need for a lot of work across the board. Right? The fact check ecosystem was 10 years in the making. Yes, we were very key to getting it off the ground, creating the structures of data that allowed us to identify it and use it in our algorithms to support the evolution of that ecosystem. Things like the Trust Project and the Journalism Trust Initiative to increase levels of transparencies. Across to looking at where are the new business models. How do we show examples of business success in the for-profit or non-profit arena to allow that to be scaled to many more players around the world? I'm in many ways still hugely optimistic. I'm hugely optimistic about us being able to, the collective community, being able to create a vibrant, thriving, sustainable ecosystem of journalism. I'm far more concerned about the political sphere around the world because I fear, I go back to, and this is going to sound overly intellectual, and I was not a terribly good student in college, but Plato did suggest that democracies would fail based on the freedoms they enable. And I think the key question that we face and have faced for a long time is, as I said earlier, the internet has enabled free expression unlike what we have ever seen. But it then poses the extraordinary paradoxical question of how do you manage free expression in a digital world? What does managing free expression mean? And how does one do that without falling victim to powerful influences who would rather control the information space in their own interest? This is, I think, akin to a massive question that we have to address. And that's what terrifies me. That's what makes me pessimistic.
Well, and on the political space, Maria, the last time we spoke, you invoked the word fascism, and it caused a little bit of attention, as a result. Tell us where your head's at and why you brought up that word and where you see that developing.
I think fascism is winning. It is death by 1,000 cuts.
A couple weeks later.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, look at Hungary, right? And how Viktor Orban has incorporated white replacement theory into state ideology. Then look at CPAC, which held its summit in Hungary and had Viktor Orban as its star speaker. Then take a look at this idea of us against them. A very critical idea that led to World War II came to this. These things that divide us, that turn politics into a gladiator's battle to the death. This isn't politics. This isn't democracy. If you don't listen, you will not find the compromise point. So when you say, that politics is what's worrisome, part of the reason politics is where it is because of the distribution system of the information ecosystem. The reward system has truly atomized meaning, right? So there's no more search for meaning. Everyone is just, we've been radicalized, we've been polarized, and then radicalized. I think the key part here is to always realize that the battle is for power and money, right? It used to be, for a period of time, journalists, news organizations had both. That's no longer that. We have neither power nor money. Our business model is dead. And the kind of power we have is more like a vestigial tale. Who does have the power and money? It is technology platforms that have both power and money, and governments that are slowly, I used the word fascism from Madeleine Albright's 2018 book, where she said that what's happening all around is like, you pluck the feathers off a chicken feather by feather. This is fascism to her. I called it death by 1,000 cuts, and we're bleeding out. But here's the thing, what the social media platforms have done, and I'll use that, social media companies perhaps, right? I use the platforms because we're building a platform with the help of Google in many instances, right? We work together on this stuff because technology is critical for the future. But for those who are making way too much money, who have way too much power and money, we have come to the point where you have to ask whether people who are voting have agency, right? And this is where I look at, what are elections like? How are they influenced by our information ecosystem, where they prioritize the spread of lies laced with anger and hate over facts? This is a 2018 MIT study that showed that lies are spread at least 6 times more than facts. We journalists don't stand a chance in this kind of incentive structure, right? Because I'm not going to lie to get you to read my story, but others will. So this is also why I always say, please don't call journalists influencers, number one. And last thing, we have elections, right? This year, there are more than 30 elections. The Philippines had ours May 9th. Ours is an emblematic example of how history can be changed in front of your eyes. From 2014, information operations that literally turned Marcos, the father of our president, from a pariah to a hero. 36 years after people power ousted Ferdinand Marcos, his son is overwhelmingly elected. And part of that is because information operations changed our reality, changed what we think. And we still haven't had that. Kenya just had its elections. Brazil will have elections in October. Those elections in Brazil will be critical for climate change because they've got the rainforest, right? And then we have, what do we have next year? Turkey. You've got Africa. The year after that is, I think, the danger point, the tipping point for either fascism or democracy. The death of democracy, the rise of fascism. What is that? You have Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim population, having elections. You have India, the world's largest democracy. And, I only listen to the end. Siddharth is optimistic, but when I was at the East-West Center, the end of June, the journalists who were most frantic were Indian journalists who had just had the head of a fact-checking group arrested based on a tweet that he did years earlier. This is something I'm familiar with, right? This is the weaponization of law against us. So by 2014, if nothing has changed, and this is not anything the journalists can do anything about, if these tech platforms do not change the incentive structure and protect our public sphere, democracy will die. Oh, please, I hope I'm wrong, right? But the trend is there. You can look at every single thing. And by the way, there's a new Freedom House report that came out a few weeks ago on China, how China joined Russia, right? How their autocracy Inc. is growing. And that must stop. By 2014, more illiberal leaders will have been democratically elected, and they will cave democracy from within.
In that Freedom House report, I have it pulled up. It's at freedomhouse.org about China's growing power. We have 6 minutes left. Let's do something I can never do on TV. Questions from the crowd, questions from the audience. Let's see where the microphone goes. There's a hand back here maybe to start. Wherever the microphone goes, we will listen.
Thank you for the wonderful conversation. My name is Swapnil Mehta. I'm a PhD candidate at NYU. I research, I'm doing a data science PhD. I research disinformation online, try to understand information propagation and build tools for local news to use this for free. My question is particularly for Richard. I think historically we've seen that there is a barrier, or at least like a sort of activation energy required for non-technical folks, or primarily non-technical folks whose job description isn't doing technical stuff, to adopt cutting-edge technology. Like we saw this for AI, where until like there was a sort of front end built out, people can't really access the technology, and others have this information advantage where they know how to use it, and so they can deploy it easily. I'm wondering, and maybe as an example, people have come across AI and art in recent times, where just because there is a front end, people can now generate wonderful things with art, and this is everyone. It doesn't require any technical expertise.
Yeah.
I'm wondering when this watershed moment will happen for news media and audiences online. So we've seen that everyone talks about getting more subscribers and donors, but like based on the conversations I've had, local news doesn't have the ability to track their own visitors on their websites, because Google Analytics is really, really hard for them to use. And they can't dedicate personnel, folks, or whatever to study these sorts of the information that is theirs. So they do have lakes of data, but they have no way to analyze it. And it's all a question of like, can we build a front end for them to analyze it? So I'm wondering what's the timeline on that, and can you contribute to such efforts?
Yes, that's an important question, and I'll cite two areas. I mean, I do think progress is being made there, certainly in terms of work that we've done. One, in the area of investigative journalism, we have made available a set of tools called Pinpoint, which I suspect many people in the audience are already using. But this is a set of tools that leverages a lot of the technology we developed for search to analyze very easily, without technical capability, large corpora of documents. I think this is extraordinarily important. Been used by hundreds of organizations around the world, won awards with. And I'm not looking for credit for having won the awards, but it has allowed news organizations to do in-depth investigative analysis of documents that would not have been possible before. I think that's extremely important. Bringing journalists to the height of the ability to apply technology is absolutely crucial. To your point about audience analysis, we actually have a current set of tools that provides insights, and it sits on top of Google Analytics. For some reason, I'm blanking on the name of it at the moment, which is completely embarrassing, but it is basically what I call a decision guidance tool. It pulls together all the sources of data you want to feed into it, including Google Analytics, and then gives you recommendations and guidance as to how you might tweak your presentation of your content to drive better audience. The other things that we're looking at in that regard is, can we simplify doing further audience research? Back to my original point, we cannot be effective as journalists unless we understand how audiences perceive us, and unless we're serving what they think they need to be served. That requires really doing more audience analysis. One thing I would like to get done over the next few years is, can we simplify that effort as well? Because I've been asking for years, every organization I meet with, what kind of research are you doing about your audience? And 95% of the time I get the answer is zero. That's unfortunate, because particularly these days, as business models tend to evolve subscriptions more than advertising, it's extraordinarily important that we know how to better serve them such that they're willing to not only invest their time and energy in engaging with us, but to actually give us some of their money to support the efforts that journalists do. So I think there's a lot of work to do there. We do a lot of training. We'd like to do a lot more. Sorry to go on, but that's a very, very important question.
It is. Final question. You got 1 minute.
Thanks, Maria and Richard, for this interesting conversation. I'm Charlie Rojat from Redacción in Argentina. A very short question. Which would you say is the biggest innovation opportunity that we have as an industry, so to understand how journalism supports democracy?
Perfect final question, Maria.
I don't think we could.
Biggest innovation. Go ahead. Tell us again. Biggest innovation.
The biggest area of opportunity in terms of innovation that we should be thinking and working on.
Biggest white space for opportunity in the journalism world. Can you hear us, Maria?
The biggest space for opportunity in the journalism world.
More democracy. Yeah. What's the biggest room you see for opportunity there?
I think for a little bit, we're still the punching bag, but to kind of pick up from Richard, the news consumer insights, that's the tool that he's talking about. And I've used Pinpoint, we use News Consumer Insights, but these are all just the tools for understanding your audience and the business and then going over this. What about AI generating content? There's some groups that are working on this now. I know AP did, but here's the thing that we found, right? We need to learn data. The biggest opportunity is data. And this is something that we're working on with Rappler right now. BBC has an ontology, right? But one of the things that we did in our last elections is we had 18,000 posts that people were voting for. And we wanted to have a bio of every single candidate. And all we did was to use GPT-3, which is an AI, use AI to create story pages, the bios of these candidates, and it worked. So part of that is, I think this is also where Richard was pushing. We need to continue to innovate. Yes, even as we're under attack, even as we're fighting for survival and fighting for a new business model. So, my new term for journalists, supermen and superwomen, we have to hold the line, and it will require so much of us, but crisis is opportunity. I'll say one last thing here, which is, the 6 years that we were under attack by President Duterte actually brought the team closer together. It pushed us to find an alternative, sustainable business model away from advertising. And by 2019, we were actually able to not just make money, but to be able to give bonuses and to grow. So, it's a time of immense opportunity, but please, if you're a journalist sitting in the audience, look at the tech. If you're a lawmaker, look at the tech. Our future depends on this.
Richard, final pithy
So
answer.
I know that question was garbled, but I also know it came from the ever eloquent Chani Guyat. And I think when one looks at the opportunity space, Chani knows the answer here because he's living the answer with Redaction. Right? I think the opportunity here, and it's what I was saying earlier, we need to, in effect, step back and reinvent journalism for this digital age. I don't say that because all of the journalism of the past was wrong. It's just that we're living in a different world, and we have to approach it in different ways. And I think it's important with our societies and with our audiences that we show them that we understand that we try new techniques, that we experiment, we see what works, we see what doesn't. But it can't just be the same old, because the world isn't the same old.
No, it's not.
So I think Chani and many others who are being the pioneering innovators at creating new news products that matter.
Now that I'm off TV, I'm going to try to grow a beard like Richard, and I'm going to try to be a superhero like Maria. Thank you for the inspiration from both of you. Thank you very, very much.
Easier to grow a beard than be a superhero.